Hello, my name is Bethany Burkhardt. I'm doing my presentation on Nineveh and Assyria during the time of Jonah, which was roughly 786 to 744 BC. It was the first half of the 8th century. So let's first go over the geography of the Assyrian Empire. It started here in Mesopotamia along the Tigris River. And this little city of Ashur, that was the Assyrian Empire's city of origin. So for probably a couple thousand years, the Assyrians consisted of just this city before they expanded out. And then these other two cities you see going up along the Tigris, they became some of the empire's biggest cities. We have Calhu here, and then Nineveh, a bit north. Calhu became the capital in the early 9th century, and it was constructed from scratch because it has a pretty strategic location. It's still alongside the Tigris, and it's also right next to the convergence of the Tigris and one of its tributaries. So it's very good for trade, and it's sandwiched between two of the empire's most powerful cities. As you can see from this map, this shows the expansion of the empire over time. For our purposes today, around the early 8th century, this dark green color would be most accurate for what the empire had at the time, during the time of Jonah. So now let's get a feel for what Assyrian society looked like. At the head of society, you would have your king. Like other Mesopotamian kingdoms, the Assyrian king was not seen as divine, but he was seen as divinely chosen, so his authority was divinely sanctioned. In theory, the king had absolute power. However, in practice, he was fully expected to uphold traditional standards of justice. He had to seek out the will of the gods first before he made any important decisions. And also, he had to please the upper class, because a lot of them made up his court, and it was always the nobility and upper class that would be the ones who would start rebellions. So he did have a lot on his shoulders. He couldn't just do exactly what he pleased. In your upper class, you had scholars, scribes, doctors, bankers, merchants, army officers, and officials. It was from this class that a lot of important positions would be filled. Two of these most important ones were the provincial governors, and then on a lesser level, the village managers. The Assyrian Empire, being what it was, which was very large, they needed to delegate authority to make sure that things got run. And this was in the hands of the provincial governors. They would have control over large or small provinces. Their responsibility was to collect tax, maintain secure borders, enact building projects. To make sure this all got done, they even had their own military force. So they had a lot of power. The village managers would be in control of a much smaller portion of territory, and their biggest responsibility was really just to collect tax and also to help with day-to-day decisions. In your lower class, you had tenant farmers. The situation for the common Assyrian was probably similar to medieval serfs. They would work the land that was owned by the nobility. So it wouldn't be their own land, but they would receive a share of what they farmed. And then you also had your soldiers and your slaves coming from this class. Now, the Assyrian military was a constantly working machine, and military service was compulsory. So for young men, it was almost certain that being a soldier was part of their destiny, at least for a number of years. The Assyrians were polytheistic, like all of their neighbors. Their king was their chief high priest. They would have high priests in their temples in each city, but the king was the one responsible for enacting all of the important rituals, and he would be there for all of the religious festivals. Their national deity was Ashur, named after their chief city and city of origin. They also worshipped Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, and she had a large temple in Nineveh. They also believed in lesser deities or demons. And now these aren't demons in the Christian sense, where we believe that they're fallen angels. They were more like other gods, but they were bad gods who were not worshipped. To ward them off, Assyrians would go to the temple, and the priests would conduct complex rituals They would also wear images of the good gods, just carrying around statues or putting it on their jewelry to ward off the demons. Now, the most well-known aspect of the Assyrians then and now is their military. And the reason for this is because they were quite cruel. They would employ pretty severe methods of torture to punish their rebellious vassals, or even just after conquering a city. They would utilize mutilation, impalement, they would flay people alive, they would behead the enemy army and then stack huge pyramids of heads outside of the city gates. They would leave impaled subjects on high stakes surrounding the city to be kept as a warning to other cities around that this is what happens when you resist the Assyrian Empire. And if you look to the left here, to my left, it might be your right, this is a relief that was found in one of the palaces in Assyria, and it depicts this practice of leaving impaled subjects on stakes to be seen and admired. Generally, the worst of this torture would be saved for the upper class, because in the ancient world it was really only the upper class that would be responsible for rebellions, for the most part. They were the ones who had the power, they were the ones who sort of had enough authority that they could even think about resisting the king. So they would be the ones who would receive the most intense punishment. But if the Assyrians were just trying, if they were on campaign and they were trying to conquer a city and the city gave them particular trouble, they would subject most of the populace to this and also slaughter most of them. So before we move on to the geopolitical situation in the early 8th century, I think it would be good for us to gather our bearings and just kind of situate ourselves by looking at where we are in history. So I apologize because my head is in the way, but over here on the right we have a selected kings of Israel, and then to the left it's selected kings of the Assyrian Empire. It is particularly difficult to get a good list of the Israelite kings to compare them to the Assyrian kings and their dates, because Israel went through so many kings. They had so many kings that would reign for a month, 7 days, 1 year, very short periods of time. But I included some of the most memorable ones. So here we have Jeroboam I. Now he was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel after it split from Judah. And his reign started 922, probably. That coincides with roughly Ashur-dan II, and this is the period where most people would say the Neo-Assyrian Empire began. So what this means is that for as long as the Northern Kingdom has been its own nation, Assyria has always been a superpower. It's always been a player. It's always been a potential threat. So if we go down a bit, in 883 we have the reign of Ashurnasirpal II and his son Shalmaneser III. Now they roughly coincide with the reigns of Omri and Ahab. Omri is not a very remarkable king in the Bible. I don't think the Bible spends very much time talking about him, but he is a remarkable king to historians because he is mentioned in extra biblical records, including one of Shalmaneser III's records, or at least his dynasty is mentioned, the House of Omri. Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser, his son, they both conducted campaigns against Israel, and Jehu, king of Israel, became their vassal. We know that for sure. If you go down a bit, around 810 to 783, you have the reign of Adad-Nirari, or maybe Adad-Nirari III. He also conducted campaigns against Israel and Syria, Damascus. And now these two kings that we've highlighted and Jeroboam II that we have here, the reason these are highlighted is because this is the time period that we are studying right now. This is the early 8th century. We know from 2 Kings that Jonah the prophet, his ministry happened during the reign of Jeroboam II. So the kings that may have been in power when Jonah went to Nineveh, we don't know for certain. It could have either been Shalmaneser IV or Ashur-dan III. So now let's zoom in to the first half of the 8th century and see what was happening specifically in Assyria at this time. So, Shalmaneser III, who had conducted campaigns against Israel and had made King Jehu his vassal, his eldest son began a rebellion against him. And this rebellion took root in cities like Nineveh, Asher, very notable Assyrian cities. Shalmaneser's younger son, Shamshi-Adad V, put down the rebellion. And part of the way he did this was he enlisted Babylonian aid. Now, no one is quite sure exactly what happened, but somehow in this process, the relationship between Babylon and Assyria completely deteriorated, and they started fighting. So while Shamshi-Adad was fighting Babylon, a lot of his territories started becoming kind of independent. They weren't exactly seceding, but what was happening was that these provincial governors were becoming so powerful in their own right that it was almost becoming their own territory. In 810, King Adad-Nirari III came to the throne, and he conducted some successful campaigns into Israel and Syria, and he regained some of this lost territory from the governors. That's an interesting date, 810 to 783. It's good to keep in mind that the last campaign into Israel, conducted by this king, was within the living memory of Jonah. So it's very possible that Jonah had first or second-hand experience of Assyrian warfare tactics. Despite this brief success, Assyria was having a lot of problems at this time. They were being hit by famine, plagues, unrest. The provincial governors were continuing to take power. And then to top it all off, for superstitious people, in 763 there was a near total solar eclipse. And in the same year, there was a big rebellion that popped up in Asher, which was the Assyrian home city. So they were struggling. They were not at a high point, and this was unusual in Assyrian history, at least in its empire days. It was unusual for them to be so disjointed and for power to be so decentralized. A lot of this power was going elsewhere to the provincial governors rather than staying with the king. Now, this is really interesting. What we know now about the early 8th century situation in Assyria makes sense of something that has confused people for quite some time. The book of Jonah refers to a king of Nineveh. Now, this has often been used by critics of the Bible to show that Jonah was clearly written late because its authors didn't know what they were talking about, because there was no king of Nineveh. There was always a king of Assyria, and then the provinces would be run by other individuals, but there were never separate kings. So who was the king of Nineveh? What's funny is it is actually an indicator of the legitimacy of the Bible, because a century earlier and a century later, calling the person who was running Nineveh the king of Nineveh would not have made sense. But at this period in history, when the provincial governors had so much power, and keep in mind they had their own military, they constructed or enacted building projects, they were running their own provinces. They were essentially kings unto themselves. So within this very specific time period of 786 to 744 BC, it made perfect sense to call the provincial governor of Nineveh the king of Nineveh, and it would not have made sense at any other time. So to summarize the situation and the Assyria that Jonah found himself in, it was an Assyria that was struggling. It was not the arrogant superpower that it had been or that it would become. It was not doing too well. It was on very shaky ground. And that might explain why, when Jonah went to Nineveh, the Ninevites were so responsive to his message. They didn't need to be told that something was wrong. They were already fully aware that things were not going well for them. However, for Jonah, the Israelites did not see the Assyrians this way. They did not see them as weak and struggling. They had vivid memories of terrible punishments inflicted by Assyrian hands. They had already lost some of their territory to the Assyrians, so there was no pity there. You can understand why it would be difficult for Jonah to bring a message of mercy and repentance to a people group that may have slaughtered your neighbors or even your own family. I can imagine that would have been very difficult. But unfortunately, decades later, when Tiglath-Pileser III came into power in 744 BC, he would begin revitalizing Assyria, and then just a couple decades later, in 722, Israel was completely annexed by the Assyrian Empire. They were all exiled. And it makes you wonder what would have happened had the Lord not had mercy on Nineveh. But we know that everything happens according to his will and for a good purpose. And so that ends my presentation on Assyria during this time period. I really enjoyed it. I really loved learning more about what was happening in the background of this book.